By the Grace of Lady Vader. Chapter 21. The first red banner rose in the Imperial center just before noon. It was torn down, and the Vader loyalist who had raised it was killed publicly and immediately. But it wasn't the last banner to go up. Many flew from windows of private homes, and as the day and the battle wore on, more troops were committed to smoking these snakes out of their holes. A great bonfire of banners burned in the marketplace, but there always seemed to be another one. The Imperial military seemed to be scrounging around for men, as it suddenly found posts abandoned and barracks mysteriously empty. It was unheard of, and yet it was happening. Stormtroopers were deserting, and there was no time to round them up, not with the battles to be fought. Lawlessness began to sweep through Coruscant as the military police forces were stretched thinner and thinner. Stores were looted, and libraries sacked by roaming bands of thugs who were loyal to no faction. Deep in the Imperial Palace, Palpatine felt the first tremor of fear. The Gungan ship Nas was coming from Rhodia to Bespin. It was an old ship and probably wouldn't survive long in a space battle, but it held a huge crew, and all had expressed a desire to be in the fight, even if it meant almost certain death. "We's are gonna fight for Queen Amidala," was the general, excited sentiment. There was a general feeling that once she was in firm control, she would take back Naboo and give them back their wrecked lands to repair. Captain Major Dur Kalpar wasn't sure it would happen, but he knew that he had to try. It was their only chance. "This battle's going to be over before we get there," the comm officer cried out, disappointed. He was a young boy who had never even lived on Naboo, but treated the Ultimate Alliance as a sacred relic. "Then we shall be glad of it," Kalpar said. "This is not our kind of battle, up here in the sky. If this where we fight, then we fight and die well. But maybe she's got something where we can help her more." As if in answer, a light flashed on the comm panel. The young officer answered it. "Captain Kalpar, sir," he said, "is from the Executor." Vader saw his son return to the bridge, and knew immediately that the talk with Leia had not gone well. Amidala realized it too, and turned away in anguish. Luke moved to stand beside them without saying a word. Vader had known that Luke would not be successful. His wife and son were so certain that Leia would be as easy to convince as they would be in a similar situation, but he knew better. She would be no easier to convince than he himself would be. That thought pained and concerned him. He knew, better than Luke or Amidala ever could, where this was likely headed for her. He felt that she would be with them in the end, or at least, he hadn't closely considered any other alternatives. But there would be a price to pay. Leia's stubbornness would not be broken by a few tearful conversations with her brother and mother. It was going to take something far more drastic to move her, and he wasn't sure that his family was prepared for that. The Falcon was still on the main viewer, still out of their reach, and just barely avoiding the fire of the Imperials. Vader couldn't help thinking the circumstances were ripe for disaster. "Her refusal to listen is not surprising, Luke," he said. "We will be better able to deal with it once she's brought back on board." "Do you really think it make a difference where she is? She's too upset to handle any of this." "That is not my concern right now," Vader replied. "She must be kept safe, and the only way to truly do it is to have her here. The details of the arrangement can be worked out later." Luke frowned deeply, and Vader caught him giving Amidala a concerned look. "What troubles you, son?" Vader immediately asked. "Everything," Luke replied with a sigh. Vader was surprised by the answer, but found it to his liking. "Good. Given all that's happened, you should not expect otherwise." "And you? Are you troubled?" Luke asked. "Always," Vader replied. Amidala shook her head, impatient with the turn of the conversation. "The troubles are nearly over now, for both of you, and for all of us." "Your Majesty!" Amidala turned to Piet. "Yes, Admiral?" "We're receiving transmissions from those who have pledged to help us. Many of them are asking us for orders. Shall I tell them to come to Bespin?" Amidala glanced at the display on the console in front of her. "No. We should begin thinking a little more broadly. There are other places in the galaxy we need to worry about." Vader stood behind her and looked over the list. It was an impressive force considering how hastily it had been arranged. They would have much more manpower than they had anticipated, and several of the groups had modern ships and weapons at their disposal. It was then a particular item on the list caught his eye. "The Nas?" he asked. "The Gungans?" His wife's face spread into an exultant grin. "Yes, it is. Amazing. Admiral, hail that ship." It took several minutes for a response to come back, but when it did, the audio picked up a joyful Gungan yelling, "Queen Amidala!" There were several other Gungans cheering and shouting in the background. Over the noise, the commander spoke. "Misa Kapan Galpa, Your Highness. We're coming to help you." Luke gave his mother a confused look. Vader was sure he had never even heard of a Gungan, but she just kept smiling and replied to the hail. "Captain, you can't know what good it does to hear from you. I know how the Gungans in Naboo have suffered over the years. One of the first things I'll do is to return to Naboo and restore our home. You have my word on that." "Yes, Queen Amidala. We know you fixing everything. You's a real Naboo, not like Bombad Emperor." Vader squeezed Amidala's shoulder, happy for her that her people were supporting her. He knew that probably meant more to her than any of the others that had decided to help. "Captain, perhaps it would be better for you not to come directly to Bespin. We need to start solidifying our position in other systems." "Where you's wanting us to go?" She paused thoughtfully. "Perhaps you should be the first unit to move on Coruscant. We will send others, of course, and we will be there ourselves eventually, but we need to bring the capital under control." "Yes," the Gungan replied enthusiastically. "We'll crunch the Emperor." Vader had the strangest urge to laugh, despite the dire seriousness of what was being proposed. "I'm not sure that's the wisest course of action." "Oh, it is. We're ready for the fight." "I'm sure you are," Amidala said, "but we need to secure the city first. Palpatine can be dealt with later, when we have a greater number of reinforcements." "Queen Amidala, we're ready to do whatever you're saying, but we want to do this for you, for all Naboo." Amidala was shaking her head no, but Vader interrupted. "If perhaps they receive help on Coruscant, it might be worthwhile." "We have our supporters there, Anakin, but I'm not sure that would be enough." "If the opportunity presents itself, they should take it. That's what we're gonna do. We're make the city safe, and then seeing about the Emperor." Amidala nodded. "That sounds fine. Hopefully we'll finish here and be able to join you soon. Good luck, Captain." "We need no luck. We see you and we make you Empress, Queen Amidala." "Your Majesty!" Amidala shut off the comm while Vader turned sharply at the panicked sound in Piet's voice. The Falcon was under renewed attack by the skiff that had come from the Iron Will. "We may not be able to leave as early as you hope, my lady," he said to Amidala. The executor moved deeper into the fray. There were still many non-humans on Coruscant, if you knew where to look for them. Kalpar did, and he knew that almost all of them would be more than happy to fight Palpatine. And that would be justice. Landing the Nos was the hardest part. Comm had picked up a coded signal, a constant beacon sent up from the Gungan exile communities that sounded the most receivers that would be static, but came across as lapping waves on Gungan receivers. That was the window. Kalpar sent a message on the frequency. The comm station was already manned. "We got big things happening here," the staffer said. "Are you being ready for something bigger?" Kalpar had asked, and only 30 minutes later, the Nos had slept under a radar shadow and landed in a decrepit part of the old city. About 10 Gungans joined them. "What's happening here?" Kalpar asked before taking names. "The red flags," a native said with a big grin, "and lots of trouble. They no got enough troopers to be keeping it down now." "You been shooting them?" "No, they been dropping out, or going to the lady. They having fights with each other some places." "Who's leading these?" The native Gungan shrugged, obviously neither knowing nor caring about stormtroopers no matter who their allegiance was to. "Well then," Kalpar said, "first thing going first. Where's the most people we can be getting to?" The Gungans took him to the square of the slum, where people of all sorts seemed to be having an ongoing party. There were Toydarians fluttering around outside windows, Malastarians goggling at dancing Twi'leks, Wookiees tossing and batting at large steel barriers. Kalpar thought he even saw the eyes of a hut back in the darkness of one of the hollow buildings. There were humans too, maybe even some of the deserting stormtroopers. You couldn't tell without the armor, and Kalpar was perfectly happy to let them take in part of this section of the operation. It was only the other part that he wanted to keep strictly among the Gungans. Torn pieces of red cloth hung from the rusty walls, and one of the Twi'leks was wrapped in red lace, and nothing else. Kalpar snorted. These folk were going to need to stop playing it and actually do something. "Yusa people!" A few paid attention. "We are coming from Queen Amidala at the top of the new empire." A spontaneous cheer went up, and the Twi'lek and Lace unwound it and waved it like a flag. She got some appreciative stares, then seemed to notice that she was naked. She put the lace back on. But at least their attention was directed to issue at hand now. Kalpar spoke again. "We got work to do before the party starts." "Party's already started," someone called, sounding good-natured. "You're starting too fast. The city's got to get calmed down so Her Majesty can be coming here. Then we having the biggest party ever on Coruscant, because she's going to be given everything the Emperor took back away from us." Dead quiet. Many of these people had slid into a boisterous life when everything that had mattered to them had been taken. There was still a chance. Of course, some of them were doing the same thing they'd done in the Old Republic, and the Empress wasn't likely to be generous to them. But what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. Kalpar pointed to the hut. "You're back there. I see you. I know you got people to send. You need to be sending them to the market to get it calmed down. You humans, you gonna do better in the government part. The rest of you, go out and find all the folks that are hiding and can be coming out. You get them, and you go together and get the fires out." "And what about you?" a human called. Kalpar looked from side to side at the 80-odd Gungans who flanked him. "We got business to be doing at the Imperial Palace." Palpatine called his guard into the center of the palace, leaving a squad of 20 elite scarlet-clad soldiers at the door of the throne room. 40 more soldiers barred the way to the door, but he was unable to recall the majority of the troops. He was losing hold. The fear that had begun to nip at him was growing, and he had no liking for it. This was not proceeding the way he had foreseen. He should have just killed Amidala years ago when she'd first captured her, but he thought she might prove useful someday in controlling Vader, should his occasional lapses into Jedi thinking start to become more frequent. She could be brought around then and used as leverage, or killed before him to draw out his anger and pull him back to the dark side. But he had miscalculated where the true control was. He had not taken Amidala's own pernicious influence into account, and it had certainly never occurred to him that they would find one another without arranging it. Then perhaps he should have killed her when she first reappeared. It was pointless. He cast into the Force, swirling around him like a maelstrom, paths open but he couldn't grasp. He ground his teeth together. Something would open. He was destined to this position for eternity. He planned to defeat his own death, but he felt both his future and his life slipping out between his fingers, in a flow that wasn't blood, but a veil of red silk. A flash of a shadow, and a path opened. He would need to leave the palace, but he would reveal later Vader for who he was, and reveal Amidala's compliance in Vader's acts. His own hands had been quite frequently cleaned for many years. Vader's dripped with blood. He just needed to... A great explosion shook the palace, and Palpatine smelled the smoke of burning wires. Shouting voices burst in. His guard answered fire, and he could hear it, like a stringed instrument being sliced. Some of the guards were running. Palpatine seized their minds and thrust them back into the fray. He drew their weapons and fired at... He saw the first grotesquely misshapen shadow less than a minute later. Wide ankles, long necks, eyes bobbing on ugly stalks. The shadows loomed up in the smoke. Fear was replaced by loathing. Palpatine raised his arms and called on the power of the dark side. The lightning came out of the darkness of the throne room and struck down the first 3 Gungans to break through the door. The battle with the guard had been bloody, and many Gungans lie in deadly embrace with their enemies. Kalpar didn't need to keep pushing them forward. He didn't think he could stop them even if he wanted to. The battle madness had taken them. They charged forward, streaming around the bodies of their fallen comrades. The lightning threw more of them backward, pushing them into metal walls and reaching through their hearts. But even after the fight with the guards, there were still 40 left. 30, 20, 15, 10... Kalpar had reached the door of the throne room. A victory whoop rose above the angry scream of a cheated man. In the shadow, projected on a screen of smoke, he saw a knife. Han would have been content to continue sheltering Leia in his embrace, to just sit and let the battle fight itself, the outcome be damned. At that moment, even though continuing the way he would have been certain death, having his last moment to be at least some attempt to directly protect her would almost be worth it. The only thing that didn't make it worth it was that the fact she would mean she would die too. But life, or fate, perhaps in this case conspiring with the Empire, has always had plans, which at this point was apparently the Empire taking all the shots at the Falcon they could get, and seemed to preclude any sort of plans on the part of Han or Leia, and had done so for as long as either could remember. He thought as he leapt back into his seat, disengaging the autopilot. Autopilot was nothing compared to the, if only barely at this point, thinking mind of a living pilot. Not the least of those plans being the Vader's plans for Leia, which Han had no desire to think about, nor had the luxury of doing anyway. Not with this attack skiff from the Star Destroyer that had first fired on them, now seeming to get its second wind and bearing down on them. The Imperial fighters that had been providing cover for the Falcon, for reasons Han just as soon didn't think about, wouldn't hold out forever, and not against something more than marginally better armed than they were, like this battle tank of a skiff. Second winds had a tendency of blowing out quickly though, and Han decided he would see if he could make it happen any quicker. He and Chewie deftly piloted the Falcon among the crisscrossing maze of laser fire and ships, not avoiding the edges of that maze with as much berth as he had always hoped, but still avoiding it. But he knew that even as good a pilot he was, or even Chewie were, they wouldn't be able to run forever either, and the margins by which the Falcon was escaping certain death seemed to be diminishing with each passing minute. They had to get out of the star system, away from Bespin completely, even if it meant leaving the rebels and Luke. He winced internally, behind. Leia was strong, but enough was enough. She'd been under constant psychological fire ever since that blaster intercepted transmission from Lady Vader. And to Han, getting her out and away from the worst of that was more important than any battle the rebels were fighting, even if his best friend was on the wrong side of that battle. Knowing Luke was there at the side of the Vaders, and even worse, trying to get Leia there as well, had unnerved and angered Han in more ways than one, once the shock had dispersed somewhat. Back when he'd last seen the kid before the Battle of Hoth, he had little worry for him. He thought Luke was going to have a strong head on his shoulders. Han still believed no matter what, that was still the case. Even though he didn't discount the possibility that something rather large and hard had impacted Luke's skull, and if someone with that strength could so quickly be swayed by the Vaders, what chance did Leia, even with her new strength, have against them? The way they kept directing shots at her, it was a wonder she'd rebuilt anything in her at all, and they would just tear it back down again. And damned if he was going to see anyone, even if that and someone included Luke, do that to her. This was one of the reasons he stayed a smuggler. You would never have to feel the gut-twisting guilt of being forced to trade one's friend's fate for another, even though the kid had been strong enough to make this decision consciously on his own. Han just never imagined the next time he found Luke again, it would be Luke willingly at the side of their worst enemies. The same ones that had caused Leia, his own friend and blood, such unnecessary pain. Parents or not. One of the crimson splash ties covering them vanished in an even brighter crimson flash, the skiff moving in closer to take advantage of the gap it had created. It was, while getting steadily closer, still barely outside the range where it would get a clear weapons lock on the Falcon, but that hadn't stopped them from taking all the blind shots it could. And in many ways, an enraged blind man was more frightening than the one who was taking calculated shots. With a calculated man, at least there was some chance of a pattern you could detect and take advantage of. There was a sudden rumbling from Chewie, and Han sharply directed his gaze to another part of space, not far from the edge of Bespin's gravity well, which was rapidly filling with a blossom of red-orange fire as one of the Empire's Star Destroyers, overcome by damage from both sides, was finally overcome by it, leaving a gap in the enemy perimeter. Han wasted little time. He shot a glance back at Leia in the seat behind him, his insides tightening at the carved-eyed expression of pain on her face, and was immediately reminded of Luke once more. "Tighten your seatbelt, sweetheart," he warned. "I've grown rather fond of you, and I'd rather not have to peel you off the back of the cockpit if we make it through this." Leia's face was incredulous. At least it wasn't icy anymore. "What do you mean?" The last word took on by sudden and sharp increase in pitch, with an equally high-pitched response from 3PO. Han couldn't believe he'd forgotten to turn the droid off. As Han suddenly broke the Falcon hard left, losing their escorts and pursuers alike and braking hard for the new gap. Their escape, hopefully. "Warn me next time," Leia muttered, the color coming back into her face. "That was your warning, doll." He pushed the sublight drive lever forward, pushing all 4 crew members back against their seats. They were 6,000 kilometers from the debris-littered gap and closing, but they weren't closing fast enough, it seemed. "Give me more speed, Chewie!" The Wookiee moved quickly to comply, flipping levers and switches near him, but suddenly the ship jerked explosively, as if hit by a small meteorite. Han shunted away that memory, but no impact registered on the sensors. "Let me guess," Leia muttered, shifting her grip on the back of Han's seat. "Now's the time when one of us should say, 'I have a bad feeling about this'?" "Complain all you want later. Right now, I'm trying not to get us killed." The Wookiee growled a quick, angry response, which caused the blood to freeze in Han's face. "What did you say?" "I believe that he said, sir, that the—" 3PO began hopefully. "Can it, Goldenrod," Han shot back, swearing internally, running any number of possible solutions in his head, hoping for a feasible one. He tightened his lips in a grim line. A lot of those possibilities weren't possibilities if you were minus 1 sublight engine. "I know what it means when the causing of one of our sublight engines is fractured." The old Leia would have made some crack about how all the parts of the ship, particularly the engines, seemed to share a symbiotic tendency towards malfunction. Instead, her eyes widened in an expression that to Han still, despite its frequent presence in the past months, looked alien on a face like Leia's. Fear. With a fractured casing, the engine was as good as non-existent now. If he tried to use it, there wouldn't be a Falcon left to save. And with it gone, it was a definite detriment to gaining additional speed. Of course, it seemed to have a little trouble in being at a loss of speed. "Sorry, sweetheart," Han muttered. "Looks like you have to tighten your seatbelt again. We've got some flying to do, and if we're going to make that gap." Even now the debris cloud was dissipating, which would mean any sort of cover the Falcon would have in that area would be gone. Already it looked as if one of the destroyers, exchanging fire with the Liberty, was trying for the position already. Han flipped a couple of switches, draining power from the life support and atmospheric thrusters into the remaining engines. If they didn't make it out of here, those functions were useless anyway. By this point their Imperial escort, and the pursuers as well, had compensated for the previous loss of target lock, and were closing in fast, faster than the Falcon was on their gap. The skiff was firing again, its shots coming closer and closer to being accurate as they skirted the very edge of the maximum weapons range. "Concentrate power on the rear shields, Chewie," Han ordered. "It won't do us any good if they blow off another sublight or our hyperdrive. It would also gain them that much more speed without the energy drain from the forward shields. It would gain them at least a few more kilometers per second. At least with debris field clearing, the risk of them getting hit by that was minimal. But there was still the possibility they'd be hit by one of their pursuers. But their unasked-for escort could probably function in that capability long enough for them to get out. Suddenly one of the fighters swooped in front of the Falcon, and Han jerked the ship and missed the fighter by a handful of meters. "What the—" But then he knew, as the other fighters moved in front of the freighter as well. "So much for the escort," he muttered. "Looks like they're not any more keen on us leaving than the ones trying to kill us." Their passage out of here was blocked, and their cover from the skiff was gone. Briefly, Han considered taking the Falcon to dock in one of the Malkar cruisers, but that would mean the cruiser lowering its shields to let them in, and they were all occupied by the destroyers anyway, even though the rebels themselves seemed to be faring unusually well. But if the Vader still thought this assistance could sway the rebellion over to their side, he could think of that at least 3, 4 if you count 3PO, that wouldn't be joining them. He couldn't afford to waste time dodging these crimson gnats. "I know you enjoy the view from back there, Highness, but we need somewhere in the lower gunnery turret. We're going to have to blow past our own escort if we want out of here. I want to make sure our tail's still covered." He ignored the cold look he received in return from the Princess as she made her way to the turret from where, not too many years ago, an eager young Tatooine farm boy had giddily blown ties away into space dust as they fled away from what had been, until the appearance of Lady Vader, been the greatest instrument of mass destruction the galaxy had known. He was going to miss the kid, even if he turned against his own friends. The Falcon charged gamely forth from a battered speed, getting its own second wind, firing its red laser cannons at the fighters. Not expecting fire from that quarter, 2 of the 5 fighters quickly sustained damage, one spinning off hopelessly to burn up in Bespin's nearby atmosphere, and the other 3 scrambled to reform, leaving Han in his gap again. From in the back he could hear the satisfying thum-thum of the gun turret as it was fired. At least back there Leia was doing some good, and it would get her mind off the... Chewie's loud and sudden roar was the only warning, as a split moment later, a green flash seemingly a kilometer wide blinded them, and the Falcon suddenly careened off course into space. An explosion of blue sparks from his console dancing in Han's face. As the ship spun, he saw Chewie lurch hard to grab onto his armrest, barely managing to stay in his seat. 3PO's startled scream as he slammed into the rear side of the cockpit, which was abruptly cut short. The huge Wookiee broke Han's fall, keeping him from meeting the same fate as the droid and allowing him to fight his way back into the pilot's seat. Han knew they had been hit. His immediate instinction was to run for Leia in the gun turret. There was very little protection in there, as if it had been in her area that was hit, but there was nothing he could do. He unsatisfyingly assured himself, no time to curse the tunnel vision that had caused him to briefly lose sight of the destroyer, or the fact that his piloting skills hadn't kept them any longer. He had to regain control of the ship, if that was possible, with his console fried. They hadn't been directly hit by the fire of the Star Destroyer, he soon discovered. Whether it was the one that had first fired on them, he didn't know. Otherwise, he wouldn't be around to thinking this. But they had been grazed by the massive laser beam. The force of that energy impacting them, slamming through the port side of the tiny ship and throwing it into a spiral, and vaporize any circuitry essential to navigation, including Han and Chewie's consoles. Fighting against vertigo and the bile rising in his throat, Han pulled onto the steering controls, barking at Chewie to do the same, trying to put an equal counterforce onto the force that had kept the ship spinning, trying to slow the spin or at least gain some semblance of clear heading. But it was to no avail. They were in the same situation as that fighter they'd hit. No engines left to fight the gravity. They were sinking right into the gravity well around Bespin, heading straight for the planet. Not far away, just coming around the edge of the planet's bulk, lurked the bulk of the Executor, suddenly not looking as beleaguered as it had before. The vertigo was pulling at him, pushing, pulling. Han ceaselessly toward the sorely tempting, pain-free avenues of unconsciousness. As the gravitational pull grew stronger, the speed of the ship's spin increased as well, and soon the ability to fight was no longer within Han's grasp. Han last thought before the black zoomed in on his consciousness, as the tannish sphere of Bespin spiraled ever larger into the viewport, was that he had failed Leia. He hadn't saved her, and now they would die. Even worse, the last thing he was going to behold was an ugly planet, and not her tiny, perfect face. As consciousness vanished, and Chewie's pained growl began to die away, Han found himself for the first time in his life, and his last now, apparently, praying that she was unconscious now, and would feel no pain.